Hi, I'm Molly Rothenberg. I'm from Tulane University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this extraordinary panel. This is called Beyond Boundaries 2, and we have 3 panelists. Our first speaker is Arin Keeble. He's from Newcastle University. You have his abstract, of course, but let me introduce his title. Beyond the Boundaries of 9/11 Fiction, Cricket and American Identity in Joseph O'Neill's Netherland. So, Arin.
Just out of curiosity, has anybody read Netherland? O'Neill's, oh, excellent. Thought that might be the case. Okay, in his 2007 article, Bowling Alone, Joseph O'Neill strongly suggests that American society's lack of interest in cricket deprives it of any possibility of a real understanding of Beyond a Boundary. Quote, "The trouble, of course, is that Americans, even if they are Americanists, can't read Beyond a Boundary. They can follow the words, but with what prospect of understanding them? How could their reading not be riddled with misconceptions, guesses, gray areas?" Unquote. O'Neill finds this deeply regrettable because he feels that Beyond a Boundary could be instructive and valuable to American society, particularly in the turbulent post-9/11 years of the War on Terror and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Quote, "For this book is where James offers the most complex, literary, and heartfelt synthesis of his preoccupations. Using cricket to blur boundaries between white and black, colonized and colonizer, ancient and modern, political and social, he stages a brilliant attack on that categorization and specialization, that division of the human personality, which is the greatest curse of our time. His concern was profound and by no means abstract. Are there more consequential divisions of human personality than the ones currently imposed by religion and nationality?" Unquote. Alluding to the relevance of Beyond a Boundary in a post-9/11 era of American history characterized by nationalism, paranoia, and religious fundamentalism, O'Neill suggests that for Americans, the mystery of cricket is still the, quote, "mystery of the other," unquote. And his conclusion in this article suggests that this is symptomatic of a deeply isolationist moment in American history. Quote, "It's a shame. It puts C.L.R. James's greatest book beyond a boundary. It also raises James' big question in another form. What do they know of America who only America know?" Unquote. My argument in this paper is that in the 2008 novel Netherland, O'Neill adjusts this rhetoric and finds a way to articulate 2 of the most universal and resonant themes in Beyond a Boundary to an American audience, and ironically successfully uses cricket to reassert America's national identity as a genuinely international rather than Eurocentric melting pot. Moreover, as Netherland's other key context and subject, the aftermath of 9/11, has been a problematic subject for writers of fiction, O'Neill's borrowed rhetoric becomes the catalyst for a challenge to the dominant paradigms of the 9/11 novel and opens up a more reflexive and politicized discussion of the attacks. Netherland has many superficial links to Beyond a Boundary. For example, the Trinidadian character Chuck Ramkissoon, who forms a close friendship with the main protagonist Hans, vividly recounts listening to the BBC Test match special coverage of the same West Indies team, captained by Frank Worrell in Australia in 1960 and 61, that James famously concludes his book with. There are many examples of the presence of James in Netherland, but it is in 2 less obvious but deeply significant ways that Netherland brings the central issues of Beyond a Boundary to bear. Firstly, echoing James's unexpected political turn, the novel dramatizes an unexpected politicization, facilitated and articulated through cricket, and cricket becomes the novel's central metaphor for plurality and civil conduct in a time of both personal and public crisis. Secondly, the novel harnesses James' conflicted sense of identity, articulated movingly in Beyond a Boundary in the author's agonizing decision over whether to join Maple or Shannon. This is redeployed in Netherland to articulate the complex issues of national identity in the aftermath of 9/11. Now, before discussing the specific ways in which Beyond a Boundary resides in Netherland, a brief overview of the 9/11 novel, which I've alluded to, is necessary. That 9/11 has been depoliticized by its literary representation is an argument that has been often made, and some of the most high-profile examples of 9/11 fiction focus on the privileged American domestic and on traumatized individuals, families, and couples. Books like J. McInerney's The Good Life, Claire Massoud's The Emperor's Children, Don DeLillo's Falling Man, Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, and even Cormac McCarthy's The Road, all eschew any kind of explicit political discourse in favor of narratives of trauma, and usually center around a domestic or relationship narrative. In one of the first overviews of 9/11 fiction, The End of Innocence, Pankaj Mishra, actually discussing Ken Kalfas's novel A Disorder Peculiar to the Country, expresses his frustration at this trend. Quote, "Are we really meant to think of domestic discord, also deployed by DeLillo and McInerney, as a metaphor for post-9/11 America?" Mishra's argument was developed by Richard Gray and Michael Rothberg in a special issue of the Journal of American Literary History. In Open Doors, Closed Minds, American Prose Writing at a Time of Crisis, Gray cites Falling Man, The Good Life, and The Emperor's Children in his prognosis that in early 9/11 fiction, quote, "the crisis is in every sense of the word domesticated," unquote. Rothberg, in responding to Gray's article, also develops this analysis, calling for a fiction of international relations and extraterritorial citizenship. And he cites Moishen Hammond's The Reluctant Fundamentalist and Netherland as novels that begin to undertake this project. Rothberg's reading of Netherland is cursory, though, and he doesn't detail the discussion of post-9/11 social realities, identity politics that it engages with, and for which, I argue, it is significantly indebted to Beyond a Boundary. Netherland plunges its protagonist into politics in its departure from the same narrative conceit as many of these domestic novels of 9/11. It's a story of a privileged Manhattan-based couple whose marriage disintegrates in the aftermath of 9/11. However, while the other novels use the process of working through or reevaluation to absorb the traumas of 9/11, Netherland uses Hans and his wife Rachel to represent two sides of a political polemic. Rachel, who is British, is staunchly anti-Bush, and after leaving the family home, repeatedly issues fierce arguments against the belligerent post-9/11 military aggression of the Bush administration. Hans is traumatized and defensive and has trouble orienting himself politically. Quote, "In this ever-shifting, all-enveloping discussion, my orientation was poor. I could not tell where I stood. If pressed to state my position, I would confess the truth, that I had not succeeded in arriving at a position. I lacked the necessary powers of perception and certainty, and above all, foresight. The future retained the impenetrable character I had always attributed to it," unquote. So the discussions or arguments between Hans and Rachel, in and of themselves, amount to a much more politically engaged narrative than what most 9/11 fiction offers. It is cricket, however, which is what Hans turns to after Rachel's departure, almost by accident, and his immersion in a local community of immigrant cricketers, that opens up space in the novel for a real interrogation of post-9/11 identity politics and social realities. So while James famously states that cricket had plunged me into politics long before I was aware of it, Hans is also thrust into a charged environment without realizing it, when he renews his youthful love of cricket. As stated, this comes in an unexpected and chance encounter. Quote, "One late April day, while lowering a box of papers into the trunk of a taxi cab, I noticed a cricket bat nestled against the casing of a spare tire. It seemed like a mirage, and I stupidly asked the driver, 'Is that a cricket bat?' As he drove, the cabbie, my future teammate Umar, told me he played every week for a Staten Island team. His glance entered the rearview mirror. 'You interested in playing?' 'Maybe,' I said. 'Well, sure, come along on Saturday. Maybe we can fix you up with a game,' end quote. Through cricket, then, Hans and the reader are thrown into unexpected territory that is uncharted in the 9/11 novel, the marginalized migrant class of New York, and it is this part of the narrative that forces him and the reader into a political engagement with post-9/11 America. At this point, we must remember another one of the crucial subjects of Beyond a Boundary is James' repeated assertion that cricket must be considered an art or dramatic spectacle, and that, as with any aesthetic construct, it must be seen as an expression of the society and politics from which it is produced. As Kenneth Surin states, quote, "As James saw it, cricket, and indeed any sporting or aesthetic phenomenon, is what it is by virtue of its capacity to express underlying historical conditions," end quote. The opening scene of Netherland resonates throughout the novel in precisely this way, as we are introduced to Chuck Ramkissoon, who monologues on cricket as a lesson in civility in the aftermath of a near-violent event during a match. This passage is worth quoting at length. Quote, "Now, games are important. They test us. They teach us comradeship. They're fun. But cricket, more than any other sport, is, I want to say," Chuck paused for effect, "a lesson in civility. We all know this. I do not need to say more about it." A few heads were nodding. "Something else. We are playing this game in the United States. This is a difficult environment for us. We play where we can, wherever they let us. Here at Walker Park, we're lucky. We have locker room facilities which we share with strangers and passers-by. In this country, we're nowhere. We're a joke. Cricket? How funny. So we play as a matter of indulgence. And if we step out of line, believe me, this indulgence disappears. What this mean, Chuck said, raising his voice as murmurs and cracks and chuckles began to run through his audience. What this means is we have an extra responsibility to play the game right. We have to prove ourselves. We have to let our hosts see that these strange-looking guys are up to something worthwhile. I say see. I don't know why I use that word. Every summer the parks of this city are taken over by hundreds of cricketers, but somehow nobody notices. It's like we're invisible. Now that's nothing new for those of us who are black or brown. And for those of us who are not, Chuck acknowledged my presence with a smile. You'll forgive me, I hope, if I say that I sometimes tell people, you want a taste of how it feels to be a black man in this country? Put on the white clothes of the cricketer. Put on white to feel black. People laughed, mostly out of embarrassment. One of my teammates extended his fist to me and I gave it a soft punch. But we don't mind, right? Just as long as we can play. Just leave us alone and we'll make do, right? But I must take a more positive attitude. I say we must claim our rightful place in this wonderful country. Cricket has a long history in the United States, actually. Benjamin Franklin himself was a cricket man. End quote. So this passage is a key to the novel and its indebtedness to Beyond a Boundary in many ways. Firstly, the clear vision of a cricket as an aesthetic phenomenon that articulates the social and historical realities in which it is played. Not only does it equate the invisibility of the American immigrant cricketers to the general invisibility of their communities, but it also gives the novel an important metafictional quality, as it addresses the invisibility of this part of America in the 9/11 novel up until this point. Additionally, Chuck's assertion that the cricketers must prove themselves is equally revealing, and it takes on a sinister post-9/11 relevance given the scrutiny that many of Americans' Asian communities suffered in the aftermath of 9/11. Most important, however, is the way Chuck's final assertion here suggests that just as cricket has a long history in the US, so does immigration. When he states that the cricketers need to claim their rightful place in this country, he suggests that as an immigrant community and a self-proclaimed melting pot nation, they are no less American than anyone else. So while Hans, like the young James in Beyond a Boundary, may not have been seeking politics by immersing himself in cricket, he became embroiled in the politics of the post-9/11, and particularly the politics of identity and nationality. Netherland continues to develop these themes, and borrowing heavily from James, develops an image of conflictedness. One of the complex subjects of Beyond a Boundary, of course, is James' identity as a colonial subject. This is most directly articulated when he describes how his fellow Marxists and activists in America could not comprehend his allegiances to certain aspects of the, quote, old school tie, unquote, or the British colonial lessons of sportsmanship and loyalty that it represented, the code. Quote, when the discussion began, they looked at me like a little strangely. I, a colonial born and bred, a Marxist, declared enemy of British imperialism and all its ways and works, was the last person they expected that sort of thing from. By the time we had discussed it for a little while, I was looking at myself a little strangely. End quote. The complicated combination of influences on James' identity is now frequently seen as one of the key sources of the unique strength of James's work, and particularly in Beyond a Boundary. Farouk Dondi notes that James, quote, openly acknowledges his debt to and origins in the colonizing culture, and then generates a defiance to its injustices using its own system of thought, history, and logic. One of the ways James' identity directly influenced his own writing was his use of unlikely pairings or comparisons. Arin articulates this neatly, quote, James, in his fundamental disposition as a cricket writer, was a unique and at times puzzling combination of the Victorian or Edwardian and the post-imperial, someone who could find a way in an article to, say, place W.G. Grace and the Guyanese experimental novelist Wilson Harris in virtually the same frame of reference. O'Neill uses precisely this conceit in using cricket to formulate a uniquely American émigré identity for Hans, who is from the Netherlands, and to articulate a striking vision of Americanness. At first, Hans sees himself as a very different kind of immigrant to his teammates, and this is articulated through his purist approach to cricket. Hans's approach to the game reveals a perspective that O'Neill cites in the article Bowling Alone, in a section where he discusses the reason that cricket is only played by a certain type of immigrant or visitor to the United States. Quote, Englishmen and Australians or South Africans don't bother to unpack their bats and whites on account, I'm guessing, of the small, scruffy, thickly grassed and weedy fields that we play on. most of which are situated in public parks and downscale neighborhoods, and come as a shock to a newcomer used to better things. He sees a playing track made not of turf but of coconut matting stretched over clay, and he sees a rough, overgrown outfield that undermines his notion of what batting is all about, hitting the ball along the ground over beautifully mowed grass." End quote. At first, Hans takes exactly this perspective, and while he's happy to play, he's unable to adjust his batting to the style of cricket his teammates play. Quote, "It was, I felt, different for them. They had grown up playing the game in floodlit Lahore, car parks, or in rough clearings in some West Indian countryside. They could, and did, modify their batting without spiritual upheaval. I could not. Self-transformation has its limits, and my limit was reached in the peculiar matter of batting. I would stubbornly continue to bat as I always had, even if it meant the end of making runs." End quote. Here, Hans delineates his traditionalist perspective, differentiating himself from his teammates, and crucially relates this to his integration into America. Despite eagerly taking to, quote, "new customs and mannerisms at the expense of the old ones," end quote, and generally not missing, quote, "the ancient clotted continent," he cannot, in the early stages of the novel, adapt to his new country in the way his fellow migres have. As James Wood states, quote, "Hans is not a colonial like his fellow cricketers, but a colonist, part of the history of Dutch imperialism that has marked places as different as Java and America," end quote. However, Hans finds a way to bridge this gap between colonist and colonial. In a powerful scene late in the cricket season of 2003, Hans is batting while Chuck watches from the boundary. Hans is faced with the familiar dilemma of his batting style, quote, "Once again confronted by the seemingly irresolvable conflict between, on the one hand, my sense of an innings as a chanceless progression of orthodox shot, impossible under local conditions, and on the other hand, the indigenous notion of batting as a gamble of hitting out," end quote. In a lyrical passage that once again evokes James, Hans continues, "There was the issue of self-measurement, for what was an innings if not a singular opportunity to face down, by dint of effort and skill and self-mastery, the variable world," end quote. But with Chuck urging him on from the boundary, Hans decides to acquiesce, to discard his pretenses and bat in the American style. Quote, "When the third ball came looping down toward my legs, something unprecedented happened. Following the spin, I executed an unsightly crooked heave. The ball flew high into the air for 6. A huge cheer went up. The next ball, I repeated the stroke with a still freer swing. The ball flew even higher, and I'd hit the ball in the air like an American cricketer, and I'd done so without injury to my sense of self. On the contrary, I felt great. And Chuck had seen it happen, and as much as he could have, had prompted it." End quote. Not only does this increase Hans's affinity to Chuck and his immigrant teammates, but it makes him feel more American. He describes the incident as evoking a dream where Chuck's radical plan to build a cricket stadium in New York, Bald Eagle Field, is realized. The milieu of his dream is the packed stadium where he and Chuck enjoy the cricket as a truly American game. Quote, "There is a roar as the cricket stars trot down the pavilion steps into this impossible grass field in America, and everything is suddenly clear, and I am at last naturalized." Just to conclude, the importance of cricket in Netherlands is clear. Not only does it provide a model of pluralism and community in the larger immigrant community in New York, but it is able to formulate this marginalized group as American, and moreover as an embodiment of the melting pot origins of the United States. Ironically, it articulates Hans's position as an outsider, but also a naturalized American. Chuck Ramekassoon's dream of Bald Eagle Field provides a symbolic site for the novel's evocation of this alternative American community. The name in itself is of course significant in emphasizing Americanness, but it is Chuck's Gatsby-esque entrepreneurialism that characterizes him as quintessentially American. His own emigre identity is brought out in a powerful scene during Hans's visit to Bald Eagle Field, as Hans and Chuck sit down and admire the perfect newly cut grass on a hot summer night. Chuck tells Hans the story of his childhood in Trinidad over cold cokes, describing his childhood in detail, including the experience of listening to the success of the same West Indians team, captained by Frank Worrell, that James champions in Beyond a Boundary. At once he is at his most American, showing off his Bald Eagle Field project and his immersion in the American dream, and yet also, for Hans, he is at his most Trinidadian, talking for the first time about his childhood. The suggestion that emerges is that immigrant realities underpin classic American ideals, and in some ways to be American is to be other. It's hard to imagine that Netherland, famously now a favorite of President Obama, could have been conceived of without the influence of Beyond a Boundary. It borrows James's delight in bringing out the complexities, nuances, and conflicts of any given subject or situation, in using cricket to complete a vision of classical Americanness. Moreover, it follows James in using the game to illuminate some of the important socio-political issues of that particular period of American history in which the novel is set, moving beyond the boundaries of domestic drama, tragedy, unity, and heroism, which are relied upon by so many of the early literary and cultural representations of 9/11.
Our second speaker is Paul Hébert. He's from the University of Michigan in the history department there. His talk is entitled C.L.R. James, Montreal, and Post-Colonial West Indian Radicalism.
Thanks very much. And thanks for the conference organizers for putting this all together and taking such great care of us while we're here. On March 28th, 1964, two West Indian students in Montreal wrote C.L.R. James, care of the BBC. Alfie Roberts from St. Vincent and Mervyn Solomon from Trinidad had two concerns. First, they were embarking on a study of West Indian intellectual history and asked James for a complete list of his works, many of which were out of print or difficult to find. Second, noting with approval James's, quote, recent efforts to push us beyond a boundary, they asked James to use his influence to advocate for improvements in the way cricket and its history were written about. The letter, which was CC'd to Frank Worrell, provides an early glimpse into the coming together of a transnational community that became a driving force in the development of black radical theory and practice in both Canada and the West Indies, a community that had James at its center. This paper draws on a number of texts produced by James in dialogue with a school of expatriate West Indian activists in Montreal to explore how some of the themes emerging from beyond a boundary, themes dealing with West Indian history and identity in the context of the democratic potentials of an emerging post-colonial West Indian state, were central to the development of a new generation of West Indian radical thinkers and activists. As the West Indies emerged from colonial rule, a new generation of intellectuals developed critiques of regional politics and society. Drawing on foundational Caribbean thinkers including James, Marcus Garvey, Eric Williams, and Frantz Fanon, and a broad scope of radical traditions including Marxism, Latin American dependency theory, the African American civil rights and black power movements, and the Southern African freedom struggle, they address the issues facing economically and racially marginalized peoples experiencing the shift from imperialism to neocolonialism. Their work took shape in conversation with West Indians living abroad, as well as with people from across the African diaspora, contributing to the development of a transnational sense of black identity upon which new anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist critiques were built. In a 1968 letter to Franklin Harvey, a Trinidadian engineering student at Montreal's McGill University, James borrowed a phrase from Beyond a Boundary, that the West Indian people were moving too fast for any label to stick, to characterize West Indians in Canada as a people, quote, constantly on the move. In a previous letter, James had noted that he was, quote, not only delighted but stimulated by the response which my work seems to have awakened in the West Indians in Canada, and the activities of West Indians in Canada, quote, seem to have political implications of a far more than merely national significance. Canada, and specifically the decidedly non-tropical island of Montreal, was a crucial site for the development of West Indian radical thought in the 1960s. In the early 1960s, Canada deracialized its immigration policies as the United Kingdom began to limit migration from the Commonwealth. This led to phenomenal growth in Montreal's Indian community. Montreal was a cosmopolitan city that already had a long history of black political activity, notably through the work of the Garveyite movement, but also because of the work of a number of locally oriented organizations. With the arrival of important numbers of people steeped in West Indian political traditions, the city became an important hub of post-colonial West Indian political thought and activity. In the words of David Austin, during the 1960s, Montreal was, quote, the most active site of Anglophone Caribbean political activity. Notable Caribbean thinkers and activists, including Lloyd Best, Alfie Roberts, Robert Hill, and Tim Hector, were in the city in the 1960s. With one eye on the economic and political marginalization of their home countries, and another on the racism they experienced in Canada, West Indians in Montreal played a key role in the development of Canadian black politics as they organized against the racism in a country that refused, and still largely refuses, to acknowledge even the possibility that racism existed there. These activists contributed to the development of what Kamosi Woodard calls the modern black convention movement, as they staged and participated in conferences that brought together black activists from around the world. They wrote influential critiques of post-colonial politics and society, which circulated as part of a rich print culture, and they engaged in and inspired direct action that affected developments in Canada and the Caribbean, the best known of these being the occupation of the Computer Center at Sir George Williams University in response to that university's fumbling on allegations of racism on the part of a biology professor, the legal fallout of which played an important role in the outbreak of the 1970 Black Power Revolution in Trinidad. At the intellectual center of this activity was C.L.R. James. In 1964-65, West Indians and students in Montreal formed a C.L.R. James study group, using James's work as a basis from which to develop their anti-imperialist and anti-racist critiques. In 1966, they invited James to address the second annual Conference on West Indian Affairs, an annual event staged in the mid-60s which brought people from across the West Indies and its diaspora to the city to share ideas. Shortly afterwards, James spent some 4 months over the winter of 1966 and 67 in Montreal, mentoring some of the city's community of young West Indian scholars while using the city as a base for a speaking tour that he undertook after the Worker and Farmers Party's disastrous showing in the 1966 Trinidad elections. In 1966, James again spoke in Montreal at the Congress of Black Writers, the heir to the Conferences on West Indian Affairs. This event did much to bring Black power to the forefront of public awareness both in Canada, where people could not understand why Black people were coming to Montreal and talking about getting guns, and in the West Indies, where the decision of the Jamaican government to banish Walter Rodney upon his return from the conference brought people out into the streets and the idea, if not the fear, that Black power might be a phenomenon with local dimensions onto the opinion pages. In June 1966, James wrote a letter addressed to both Robert Hill and Detroit labor activist Martin Glaberman, in which he described a serious financial crisis that he was facing as he led the Workers and Farmers Party. Hill noted that the stakes of James's situation included both the personal survival of a man who was the main intellectual touchstone of a cohort of activists and, in a broader sense, quote, the success or failure of the political opposition to the most advanced form of neocolonialism in the Caribbean. 3 decades after being at the forefront of the anti-colonial movement through activism with the International African Service Bureau and writing such important anti-colonial texts as the Black Jacobins, James, both as a scholar and an activist, was at the cutting edge of a new strand of anti-imperialist thought and activity. In his presentation at the 1966 Conference on West Indian Affairs, The Making of the Caribbean People, James, after describing the historic role of West Indians in the development of Western civilization, said, "These are my people. They are yours too, if you want them." Kent Worcester points out that in the early 1960s, as the Anglophone Caribbean achieved political independence, James sought to define West Indian identity in a way that encouraged a popular reclaiming of the region's history with an eye to the role of the West Indian people in global history. Kathleen Balutansky uses Edouard Glissant's notion of creolization to present James as a writer who, quote, distilled the dehumanizing experiences of slavery, colonialism, and racism, the main constituents of Caribbean history, into a self-consciously decentered Caribbean identity. Beyond a Boundary is an important part of James's contribution to his critiques of the development of the post-colonial West Indies. The book is an extended study of what it means to be West Indian both historically and at the moment of its appearance, as it foregrounds a dynamic, modern, mobile, and revolutionary West Indian people. James uses cricket as a way to analyze the racial and economic divisions of West Indian society. The cricket field becomes a place where those divides were contested, including the divide between colonizer and colonized. Manning Marable notes that for James, cricket was, quote, a complex crucible for the birthing of Caribbean identity and the nucleus of what became a demand for independence. In tracing how the West Indian people took ownership of cricket, James makes a larger argument about their ability to take charge of their own political destiny, regardless of what metropolitan officials or emerging national elites might have thought. Like all of his writing, Beyond a Boundary is guided by a broadly democratic vision in which every cook can govern. As James worked with West Indian expatriates in Montreal, he drew on Beyond the Boundaries' framing of the West Indian people as he outlined powerful critiques of the failure of the post-colonial West Indian state to create a space that would allow for the development of a modern and democratic West Indies. In February 1967, Hill interviewed James for the CBC. Asked about the tendency of the West Indies to produce revolutionary figures such as Toussaint Louverture and Arthur Cipriani, James characterized the West Indian people as extremist, in that the region's economic and social relationships created a class dependent upon foreign concerns, which controlled the economy for their own well-being, and a class who were shut out of the limited opportunities provided by foreign capital, with little room between for the development of an independent middle class. In the years after the publication of Beyond a Boundary, James focused on the question of how an inherently rebellious West Indian identity developed in the context of a historic relationship with foreign capital. The Making of the Caribbean People is an exploration of the historic forces which shaped West Indian identity and the role of West Indians in the development of Western civilization. It is also a meditation on revolution. James puts the Middle Passage and racialized slavery at the center of his analysis of the West Indian revolutionary character. As people were brought from one part of the world to become, quote, an entirely new social and historical category, West Indian identity was shaped by one dominant fact, quote, the desire, sometimes expressed, sometimes unexpressed, for liberty and ridding oneself of the particular burden which is the special inheritance of the black skin. This is what made the West Indian people, quote, the most rebellious people in history. Thus, James counted a slave uprising in Barbados in the middle of the 17th century where, quote, the slaves fell upon their masters and cut all their throats to make themselves not only free men, but masters of the land, as the beginning of West Indian history. Slave rebellion also figures prominently in James's surviving address from the Conference of Black Writers, the Haitian Revolution and the Making of the Modern World. This may be seen as a companion to the 1966 Montreal talk, in that it focuses on the role of revolutionary thought and practice in the development of West Indian history. It also explores the unfulfilled democratic potential of the post-colonial West Indian state, contrasting a vision of the West Indies that counted 20,000 leaders ready among the popular masses with a vision on the part of elites who had a false idea about the capabilities of the West Indian people. This lack of awareness informed developmentalist thinking about how unready colonized people were for independence. In both the 1966 and 1968 talks, James explores the gap between the potential of the West Indian people and the image of those people held by metropolitan officials and local nationalist elites, who were blind to the modern and revolutionary dimensions of West Indian identity. West Indians, James argued, lost their connection with the revolutionary identity once, quote, the colonial office gets a hold of us to educate us. This, he argued, had important effects on the development of the post-colonial West Indian state, developments that he linked to his earlier anti-colonial scholarship. In The Making of the West Indian People, James borrows from his 1930 anti-colonial past to link the blindness of metropolitan officials and local elites to the nature of the West Indian people to the frustrations with the contemporary post-colonial state. Quoting a passage from the Black Jacobins about how their revolutionary nature, forged by their history as West Indian people, allowed the people of Saint-Domingue to transcend, quote, watching inflated little governors and mediocre officials from Europe pass them by and take charge of their own political destiny, James notes that in both 1938 and 1966, too few people understood the ability of the West Indian people to control their own futures. Drawing out the parallels between anti-slavery and anti-colonial activism and the contemporary Caribbean, James noted that, quote, the savage ferocity of some of the West Indian rulers towards the populations who have put them in power was rooted in the historic conditions at play as freedom was won. Just as in Haiti, where the old gang, those who had become generals, administrators, and the part of the new government, house slaves of the most subservient kind, jeopardized the hard-won gains of the people, the, quote, subservience to a ruling class by new rulers was, quote, rampant all over the Caribbean today. By delaying self-government to the West Indian people, miseducating them and warping the development of their political consciousness, this emerging nationalist elite had the effect of, when independence came, depriving the West people of their self-confidence and that dynamic. Because, quote, for the last half-century, they were deprived of making the Caribbean people what their history and achievements had made possible. While in Montreal for the Congress of Black Writers, James addressed a rally in support of Walter Rodney, who had returned there after his expulsion. He characterized the banning of Rodney and the violent police response to the demonstrations that broke out in Kingston in response as instances of a neo-colonial tendency for outdated modes of power to confront modern people. This was, quote, a violent confrontation between the backwards reactionary government that is still living in the 17th century with a population that is part of the 20th century. For James, as for the students and the sufferers in Kingston who had met violent state repression, Rodney's banishment was symptomatic of, quote, the way that the educated classes in the Caribbean misgoverned the independent West Indian states. James tied the expulsion and the ensuing violent response to pro-Rodney demonstrations to critiques of the West Indian political elites that he had made in Party Politics in the West Indies, published a year before Beyond a Boundary. There, he had argued both the governments that failed to reflect the democratic will of the people would find themselves confronting resistance that would provoke deadly force, and that the West Indian middle classes were too wrapped up in pursuing material wealth to have a meaningful engagement with the history and the development of the West Indian personality. Turning Eric Williams' nationalist mantra back on its speaker, he told his Montreal audience, "Massa they done, and they have become massa." In an interview given to a McGill campus paper that week, James developed his analysis of the links between the political economy of the post-colonial West Indian state, the centrality of revolution to West Indian identity, and the connections between that revolutionary dynamic and a freedom movement with global dimensions. He noted that the West Indies were in a potentially revolutionary state, given the level of foreign ownership of local resources and the population density. He tied this revolutionary potential to a global emancipatory tendency that had black liberation as a principal driving force. Again pointing to the dynamic nature of the West Indian experience, West Indians were, quote, people on the move, in harmony with tremendous social and political developments that are taking place in Western civilization itself. It may be black power here, another thing there, independence here, freedom, democratics right there, and black people in America and in the Caribbean must look upon the African revolt as a symbol of what is likely to take place everywhere and to which we are very closely allied. In the wake of the Rodney riots and the occupation of the Sir George Computer Lab a few months later, a particularly West Indian approach to black power, rooted in part in the experience of activists connected to the Montreal-West Indies nexus, became an important force in West Indian politics. While drawing on many of the same themes and thinkers that drove the African-American Black Power movement, West Indian Black Power was particularly concerned with the questions of empire and neocolonialism. Newspapers like Abeng, Moko, and Uhuru, all of which featured writing by people involved in the West Indian scene in Montreal, analyzed the relationship between the West Indies and the United States, Great Britain, and Canada as one in which vampiric metropoles extracted capital from the islands, accused local leaders of selling out black people to the highest bidder, and borrowed from the histories of men like Toussaint as models for a contemporary West Indian revolution. But even before the specifically West Indian articulation of black power came to the fore, James understood that black power was relevant to the critiques he had been developing in works like Beyond a Boundary and The Making of the West Indian People. It was in Montreal that James had his first personal encounter with Stokely Carmichael, a figurehead of what James had identified as a worldwide black revolution. In February '67, Carmichael spoke in Montreal. James was in the audience. He was so struck by Carmichael that he wrote his fellow Trinidadian revolutionary a letter. While I have not been able to read the letter in its entirety, James drew on it extensively in a speech he gave later that year. Drawing on concepts that he had been working with in The Making of the West Indian People and developed later at the Congress of Black Writers, James told Carmichael that he believed that the African-American struggle was under-theorized and lacked a solid awareness of its historical roots in not only the work of African-American figures such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, but also in the thought and activism of West Indians, including Garvey, Padmore, and Fanon. Expanding on his analysis of the links between historic anti-colonial struggles and the situation in the contemporary West Indies, James put Fanon, the intellectual heir of Padmore, Du Bois, and Garvey, at the pivot point between the formal end of colonialism and the need for black activists, quote, to carry on a desperate all-out struggle against those native leaders who may have fought for independence, as many of those leaders, quote, did not represent the forward movement of the underdeveloped peoples to some new stage of economic and political progress. James concludes The Making of the West Indian People by listing the names of some of the West Indians without whom the history and literature of Western civilization would have been possible, including Toussaint, Aimé Césaire, and René Marin. He ends, quote, with a name acknowledged by critics all over the world as an unprecedented, unimaginable practitioner of his particular art. I refer, of course, to Garfield Sobers, and that's where the speech ends. Cricket provided an icebreaker for two young West Indian men in a cold city far from home to approach an intellectual hero. That James could name-check a cricket star in that same city, a place where the names of hockey players like Maurice Richard and Jean Béliveau had far greater currency than any bowler or batsman, and do so with the full expectation that his audience would know, of course, about whom he was speaking, with no further elaboration, reminds us of the vitality of West Indian communities in diaspora. Beyond a Boundary's vision of the West Indian people as dynamic and revolutionary was central to the development of a new approach to West Indian radical thought, which took place in great part in that diasporic setting. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker this afternoon is Arin Kamugisha. He's from the University of West Indies. His talk is entitled The Caribbean Beyond, reading C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter.
With thanks to the organisers for inviting me, particularly Andrew Smith and David Featherstone, who I've dealt with the most over the last couple of weeks. I should say that my title is slightly switched to The Caribbean Beyond, C.L.R. James and Caribbean Freedom, partly because in the process of writing, when I tried to integrate the Wynter, it became a heady and a very much over 20 minutes long task. So you'll forgive me there, even though Wynter is behind a number of the interpretations of C.L.R. James's legacy that I advance and think about in the paper. So to start, the term beyond has a curious history in many landmark Caribbean texts. It finds its way like a thief in the night past authorial intention and the desired titles of works. C.L.R. James's Beyond the Boundary was originally titled by its publishers, Cricket Crusaders, itself a shift from James's working title, Who Only Cricket Know. It was under the influence of George Lamming that the title became Beyond the Boundary, itself still forsaking intention, as Lamming says he was clear that the definitive article the should have been used rather than the indefinite a, which we have of course covered earlier today. Simon Schwartz's landmark novel, Plus enfant sur Télumé Miracle, in translation became The Bridge of Beyond, far away from the more literal translation, Rain and Wind on Miracle Woman Télumé. And finally, in Sylvia Wynter, we see the use of the beyond in a more conscious form, perhaps. This time, it's not a mistranslation or a loss or a gain, but rather it's part of a speculation on the possibility of the human after man in African diasporic letters, and an urgent awareness of a need to move beyond global neoliberalism for the sake of the survival of human life on this planet. The Caribbean beyond here becomes a guide towards crafting a vision of community more daring than yet contemplated. Now, it's now almost 25 years since Hazel Carby described Beyond the Boundary as one of the most outstanding works of cultural studies ever produced, and the questions that it raises still seem inexhaustible, evidence the continual critical commentary on James's work. I wish to commence my consideration of James here with James's notes on the specific conjuncture that led him to write Beyond the Boundary. And for this, we have to go to the section of Beyond the Boundary titled, What Do Men Live By? And so, James from What Do Men Live By? In 1938, a lecture tour took me to the United States, and I stayed there 15 years. The war came. It did not bring Soviets and proletarian power. Instead, the bureaucratic totalitarian monster grew stronger and spread. As early as 1941, I had begun to question the premises of Trotskyism. It took nearly a decade of incessant labor and collaboration to break with it and reorganize my Marxist ideas to cope with the post-war world. That was a matter of doctrine, of history, of economics, and politics. These pursuits I shared with collaborators, rivals, enemies, and our public. We covered the ground thoroughly. In my private mind, however, I was increasingly aware of large areas of human existence that my history and my politics did not seem to cover. What did men live by? What did they want? What did history show that they had wanted? Had they wanted then what they had wanted now? The men I had known, what had they wanted? What exactly was art, and what exactly culture? And I think this is very important because here James clearly identifies the genesis of Beyond the Boundary as part of his Marxist attempt to reinterpret the world. And yet the wonder, of course, of the text are the pathways he took in actually doing so, which gives it its enduring value. In her article, Beyond the Categories of a Master Conception, the Counter-Doctrine of a Jamesian Poesis, her third and grandest article on C.L.R. James, Sylvia Wynter suggests that James's radical journey, simultaneously within, through, and beyond coloniality was, and I quote, a constant and sustained attempt to shift the system of abduction, first of colonial liberalism, later of Stalinist and Trotskyist Marxism, and overall of the bourgeois cultural model and its underlying head versus body, reason versus instinct metaphorics. Now, I want to address the meaning and challenge of Beyond the Boundary through reflection on two moments in his text. The first one surrounds the question of Caribbean post-colonial citizenship and the ethics of belonging to these new nations, mediated through James on cricket. And the second one takes James on the public school code and men's intimate lives. And so, I will begin. And arguably, the most revealing single part of Beyond the Boundary for any understanding of the yearning that James had for a sovereign future for the Caribbean comes, I would claim, in its conclusion. Now, James titles this Epilogue and Apotheosis, and the OED's definition of apotheosis, the highest point in the development of something, is very well seen in these 4 pages. Now, as we know, Beyond the Boundary was finished from the 1950s, and it's likely that the only reason we have this epilogue that covers the 1960 to 61 West Indies tour of Australia is because of a difficulty that James had in getting a publisher, which we've already covered in the earlier section. This tour, of course, was already significant as a result of the successful campaign waged by James to overturn the racist policy of appointing only white captains to head the West Indies team, which resulted in Frank Worrell's nomination as captain. But James himself suggests that he was driven to write in this epilogue when it became clear that the West Indies team to Australia had added a new dimension to cricket history. And his description of Garfield Sober's batting and the final farewell of the West Indies team in the series deserves particularly close attention. And I'm going to quote here at some length. The first innings of Sobers at Brisbane was the most beautiful batting I have ever seen. Never was such ease and certainty of stroke, such early seeing of the ball, and such late leisured play, such command by a batsman not only of the bowling but of himself. He seemed to be expressing a personal vision. I had thought of him as having too much bowling to do, but after that innings I knew that such batting can come only at moments, and until they come, the unfortunate artist has the disruptive task of adjusting himself to what he can do in relation to what he knows is possible. This is a sphere beyond the unfailing self-mastery of a Bradman or a Hutton. Yet my greatest moment was the speech-making after the last test. Sir Donald Bradman was remarkably reminiscent of a chairman at a party celebration meeting. Only in the intervals of a return to a habitual self, while he was being applauded, did you catch a glimpse of the relentless scorer of centuries and the watchful, tireless captain. Bernot was fluent, with carefully chosen phrases, full of affection and respect for Frank Worrell and the West Indians. Definitely a man of feeling, not ashamed or wary of it, but a man seeing the whole of his world unsteadily. But Frank Worrell, speaking last, was crowned with the olive. Beauty indeed is in the eye of the beholder. I saw the West Indian easy adaptation to environment. It was after our conversations, and I could see his precise and uncompromising evaluations. Those, it seems, are now second nature. But they are draped with a diplomatic graciousness which has apparently so impressed the Australian Prime Minister. If I say he won the prize, it's because the crowd gave it to him. They laughed and cheered him constantly. He expanded my conception of a West Indian personality. Nor was I alone. I caught a glimpse of what brought 250,000 inhabitants of Melbourne into the streets to tell the West Indian cricketers goodbye, a gesture spontaneous and in cricket without precedents, one people speaking to another. Clearing their way with bat and ball, West Indians at that moment had made a public entry into the Comity of Nations. Thomas Arnold, Thomas Hughes, and the old master himself, W.G. Grace, would have recognized Frank Worrell as their boy. Now, James's language here is unsurpassed, perhaps. His description of Sober's batting is not just merely reminiscent of Solon's description of the Greek athletes, which is actually quoted in Beyond the Boundary earlier. And it is significant when we think about the question of images. James actually wanted at one point to include images of the Greek athletes and the West Indian cricketers in the book side by side. Okay? But it goes beyond Solon's description in his yearning for Sobers's performance on the field to be translated into the vision of a Caribbean nation beyond the boundary. The great batsman's command comes not merely in the tireless mastery of the bowling, which James suggests was a contribution of Bradman, but through the confident knowledge that the field of play is his to control, leading to a demand that his artistic intelligence creates something new. In this epilogue, we learn that James's greatest moment of a tour came not on the field of play. In his descriptions of Bradman, Benoit, and Worrell, at the awards presentation ceremony, James sketches his vision of the transitional moments between different cricketing personalities and different masculinities of different ages in a mere paragraph. Bradman's personality, tempered in the 1930s in which he played his cricket, could only play the part of a party chairman with limited success, as behind it was always a steely, watchful masculinity. Benoit, Worrell's counterpart and the current Australian captain, was far more at ease, and in a striking phrase James described him as, and I quote, definitely a man of feeling, not ashamed or wary of it. However, Worrell's speech is a highlight of a post-match ceremony. The beauty that James described was not merely Worrell's charm or the ease and clarity of his speech, but a means by which an indisputably West Indian sensibility could be crafted into a disposition capable of reaching out to a world community as an equal on its own terms. The magnetism of Worrell, which James says left him after a couple of hours of conversation as tired as if I had been put through a wringer, wedded to a productivity of performance in the field and his assessment of the game, are part of the newness that the West Indian brings to the mix of global identities. Command and mastery of the masculine self is as essential as physical prowess on the field of play. This is expansion of his conception of West Indian personality that James said Worrell gave him, and indeed James claims he wishes to give us. An elegant juggling of tradition and modernity, and a constant critical reflection on the old that haunts the new. At a time in which Australia had a whites-only immigration policy, and the cricketer and writer J.H. Fingleton could condescendingly write the following to James at the end of a series about the West Indies team, the manners of them were admirable and a credit to their race. The ticker tape parade by 250,000 residents of Melbourne was an astonishing event. At this moment, West Indians made a public entry into the Comity of Nations, and such was the nature of their entry, returning to the golden age of cricket and remaking tradition anew, that James would then be on the boundary with the declaration that Arnold, Hughes and the old master himself would have recognised Frank Worrell as their boy. Yet James's scattered reflections on cricket, tradition and the West Indian middle classes suggest a perspective on West Indian cricket quite divorced from his revolutionary understandings of a free creative activity of the masses. For James here, then, the middle classes in the West Indies have been brought up within a mental and moral framework which is best represented by these three men, Grace, Arnold and Hughes. And this is from an article called The 1963 West Indians. But that must come to an end. The West Indians have reached where they are because certain of them have had the opportunity to absorb to a large degree and to adapt to their own uses a certain definitive tradition. But they have to bring something of their own now to the life that they have to live, and I believe that in the cricket that they have been playing over the last 2 or 3 years, they have found something of their own. In a related comment in a later article, tracing the same sources of influences, James notes, and I quote, "Juniors grow up and they have to make their own independent way. In cricket, the West Indies have evolved a style of their own. Even in independence as a whole, they have yet to do so." Which then leaves James to observe that we are the inheritors, not creators, but we're keeping alive a great tradition, and doing so in the only way that is ever done, by adding something of our own, remaking it anew. Now, in this formulation, though, tradition seems to be passed down here from the English to the West Indian middle classes, who seem to possess no alternative resources to draw upon other than those bequeathed by English culture. But to focus just on this is to miss the main thrust of James's point. The West Indian middle classes for James were creative in their time, in cricket and in their anti-colonial alliances, however evanescent with the working classes, but they are dangerous now in their decline in the immediate post-colonial moment. They are, despite exemplary exceptions like Worrell, unable to remake tradition anew. And here I believe is in part we can see James's subsequent interest and great attention to Garfield Sobers. If, however, we are not to be carried away by the rhetorical appeal of James's writings, we are bound to acknowledge the maleness of cricket remains. Men still, through James, in these quotes, usher in the new West Indian nation. And though women have a more complicated interpretive role in the social production of cricket culture than we may expect, for example, James's aunts, they're still, in James's cricketing parlance, marginal to the creation of the West Indian nation. And it's this kind of conundrum and James's own view of this contradiction which I want to turn to now. Because I would suggest, and this is more the second part of my paper, that particularly in the last few decades of his life, James is haunted by this contradiction over what he considers to be the problem and the space of women in the new society. And I would suggest that one of the pathways into thinking about this, and I've written about this previously at far greater length, and I'm going to do so now, is to actually think about one passage in Beyond the Boundary. And this is a passage from the chapter, I believe, titled Old School Tie. And here we have James. In an article welcoming the West Indian team of 1957, E.W. Swanton has written in the Daily Telegraph that in the West Indies, the cricket ethic has shaped not only the cricketers, but social life as a whole. It is an understatement. There is a whole generation of us, and perhaps 2 generations, who have been formed by it, not only in social attitudes, but in our most intimate personal lives. In fact, they are more than anywhere else. The social attitudes we could to some degree alter if we wished. For the inner self, the die was cast. But that is not my theme except incidentally. The coming West Indian novelist will show the clash between the native temperament and environment and this doctrine from a sterner clime. Now, to me, this quite extraordinary comment by James, ostensibly about the cricket code, reaches far beyond it and is a key illustration about the fascinating ambivalences about gender and sexuality that arise in his work. The sphere of intimacy is raised by James as a site of the deepest penetration of a public school code, but immediately on acknowledging this, he draws back from its implications, suggesting that the West Indian novelists will be the ones to fully explore this terrain. This retreat itself is ironic for a couple of reasons. Firstly, James's cricket reflections on cricket culture are a critical resource for those interested in exploring the relationship between coloniality, masculinity, and the reproduction of certain forms of gender relations in the Caribbean. These texts reveal not simply easily identifiable Caribbean masculinity with an instrumental relationship to sports which simply confirms its prowess, but compelling revelations about male homosocial bonding, the complexities and ambivalences of colonial masculinities, and a yearning for a particular productivity of performance by the male body both on the field of play and the wider Caribbean society. However, James is never completely unaware of the fact that women are narratively written out of foundational stories of a nation, and his struggles to rethink the premises which resulted in his own illusion of women's agency in the participation of a nation is, I would suggest, one of the very compelling ways in which he tries to rethink the new society from the 1950s onwards. And a fine example of this can be seen in his 1976 speech towards the 7th Pan-African Congress, Past, Present, and Future. Like most radicals, James is faced with a problem posed by the 6th Pan-African Congress, which was not only hijacked by post-independence governmental elites in Africa and the Caribbean, but for James left no particular doctrine behind it. Nearing the conclusion of this particular speech, James actually turns to a discussion of George Laming's Natives of My Person and its treatment of women to stake a claim for the immediacy and primacy of gender in the liberation struggles to come. And I will give you this quote from it. Today, Laming says, today women represent something, are something. They are a future that men must know something about. In other words, what he is saying here is what he has been saying in all his books, that men constitute an elite in relation to women, and women have got a capacity which men have got to learn. Now, the African-American activist and scholar Jerry Augusto was actually recollected having lunch with James on the day that he finished Natives of My Person. And Augusto says that James asked her opinion on the final page, in which Laming has one of his female characters conclude with the enigmatic lines, "We are a future they must learn." And James apparently then tells Augusto that he believes that Laming is actually saying that women are the last revolution. And immediately, the multiple meanings of last should come to mind. Last is latest, last is final, last is lingering. These are memorable turn of phrases, which I, of course, would suggest can only be understood through a longer thinking of James on the new society. And in saying this, one is not trying to deny the romanticism and, of course, the occasional paternalism of many of these formulations by James. It's only towards the end of his life that James seems to fully realize that his intellectual journeys always involve women at very crucial stages. So his very first short story, La Divina Pastora, he actually states was related to him by his grandmother, and then he more or less wrote out the story, okay, and made actually a story out of it. Of course, his mother engenders a love of literary in him. The powerful Johnson Forestier radical group in which he did much of his creative work in mid-century America was composed of leadership of himself, Grace Lee Boggs, and Raya Dunavevskaya. And then, of course, are his powerful intellectual interlocutors, intimate partners and wives, Constance Webb and Selma James. So James, on one level, is aware of in my earlier passage about the coloniality of men's intimate lives, he states that the coming West Indian novelist will show this clash between the native temperament and environment. However, he does not really realize where its most daring contestations might take place. So his unfinished journey never take him back to Caribbean women's experiences. However, for James, women are a future. And there's something in this sincerity of James's desire to rethink his past and a determination to move beyond the coloniality of gender relations, which still resonates today, and I would suggest is another part of a legacy of his enigmatic text. I am going to finish there. I just have a conclusion, a quick conclusion. James, as I said at the beginning, begins with that arresting passage, "What do men want?" The demand of contemporary James criticism, however, may very well be, what did James want? In Black Jacobins, it was the anti-colonial African revolution. A decade later, in Notes on Dialectics, it's free creative activity as necessity. And Beyond the Boundary, it is a world where a more complete human existence can be fashioned through the ability of all to give their powers full play. And I would close with this passage by Sylvia Wynter in which she describes Matthew Bondman and the meaning of Matthew Bondman, since we've been discussing him already. To realize their full powers, to give them full play, the Bondmans had to live in an alternative cosmology, an underground culture which they have reconstituted for themselves. In addition, it meant the total blockage of a realization of their powers, the prevention of their living of their own radical historicity, the subordination to the historicality of the productive forces, would therefore impel the bondmans of the world, les damnés de la terre as Fanon defines them, to demand, to desire as that by which alone they can live, not the liberation of the productive forces, liberalism and Marxism-Leninism, but the liberation of man. This is a great moment in Caribbean letters. Here the condemned of the world, of the earth, reject not just coloniality, but Eurocentric social theory in both its liberal and radical guises. Affect, resistance, pleasure, play, modernity, power, and desire are transformed into something new. It is this pursuit of human freedom, and not only the Caribbean theme of many of his writings, that secured James's enduring appeal as a critical thinker for our Caribbean present. Beyond the Boundary, which he claimed in the 1965 lecture to be his finest achievement, emerges as a great product of a radical cosmopolitan humanist tradition, internationalist in its scope and vision, and one of the gifts of Caribbean social and political thought to humanity. Thank you.
Because you began with Alfie Roberts' letter. It's just to say that Alfie was a cricketer himself, played test cricket, actually toured with the West Indies to New Zealand in 1956, was a kind of cricket boy wonder himself who was recruited alongside Garfield Sobers and Ron Kanai. So his engagement with James on that level is not only political, although it was largely that, but he was engaging James as he engaged Worrell, as he engaged others, as somebody who profoundly appreciated cricket. And just to go back to something Arin said about, and maybe you can expand on it a bit, you mentioned Worrell and you kind of counterpose Worrell to Sobers in a kind of way in terms of their working class versus middle class background. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, because in my conversations with Alfie Roberts, he would often refer to Gary Sobers, who was a very close friend of his, as somebody who often used green verbs, which was a way of suggesting that Gary Sobers was working class in a way that other members, other Black West Indian members and Indian members of the cricket team may not have been of West Indian players who may not have been. Arin mentioned that question in James's Beyond the Boundary, what do men live by? And I think it's a speculation that for James, it was a way of, well, it kind of comes out in the quote that you used. It's a way of James trying to think about some of the inadequacies of Marxism, but as a Marxist. And in '68, during the Congress of Black Writers, James also gave a talk that was not during the Congress, but outside of the Congress, to members of Facing Reality. And Robert Hill, who was both a member of Facing Reality and the Caribbean Conference Committee C.L.R. James study group that Paul spoke about, was at that talk. And it was a talk on existentialism. And during that talk, James is basically telling his comrades that we need to rethink some of the precepts of Marxism, even though we are Marxists, because Marxism cannot account for the individual, and in a sense, individual creativity, and also the place of the individual in the world. Right? Now, it's not a repudiation of Marxism, but it's a way of trying to extend the boundaries, if you will, of Marxist thought by drawing largely on Heidegger and Wilson Harris. I just wanted to say two things very quickly. One is, when you mentioned the number of women that James engaged throughout his life, both in his fiction and in his political organizing, and through the groups that he was involved in, I'm just wondering where Maisie, as a character in Minty Alley, fits, because in my reading of that book, she's the main character, in the sense that she's the character that stands out in Minty Alley. There are others, Benoit and other, and James seems to have, as early as 1931, 32, when the book was written, being able to intuit a gender critique that was not consistent throughout all of his writing, but the artist in James and his kind of artistic intuition allowed him to seem to have something to say about the role of women in Caribbean society that early. But again, it's not consistent throughout his work. So I just thought maybe you might have something to say about Maisie's role. And I just have one last point, sorry. In talking about Bondman at the end, and using that quote from Sylvia Wynter and the rejection of a kind of European or Eurocentric vision of the world via the Caribbean. And it's part of what I kind of want to probe tomorrow. It's a question of, like, who really was Matthew Bondman without the cricket bat in his hand? Because James doesn't talk about him. We know very little about him. And he seems to be outside the boundaries of modernity, and even from James's description of him, outside the boundaries of humanity, in a sense. And I know that sounds like a strong statement, when he's not playing cricket. And what does that mean? You know, as you know, for let's say the Caribbean underclass, the Caribbean non-middle class who do not have the instruments of modernity at their disposal.
World and Sober's underclass backgrounds, and then secondly the question about Minty Alley. Well, certainly even if you look at World's book Cricket Punch, the book is not a radical book by any means. World's Cricket Punch, his biography. And World is certainly, from Barbadian standards at that time, more or less a middle-class boy. I mean, there's certainly a very big difference between a World and a Sobers. It's interesting that what you said about Alfie Roberts on Sobers, because those kinds of jokes about Sobers are legendary in Barbados, you know, and that kind of class spite against Sobers and what Sobers represents is, you know, throughout Barbados. So I've heard a number of those over the years. So certainly Sobers as the most tremendous player of his generation, but also from a working class background, meant something very specific for James, especially if you look at the very last paragraph of his article on Garfield Sobers. He's concerned completely in that text with repudiating a particular idea that Sobers can just be seen, as he put it, as a fine accumulation of atoms, okay? He says instead he sees them as a living embodiment of centuries of a tortured history. And he speaks very clearly against a particular gaze towards the black male body that he can see sport writers are doing towards Sobers. And of course continues to the contemporary age when we look at the readings of black male bodies in sports, we look at Usain Bolt, etc. In Britain, we could say, of course, Linford Christie, the infamous case of Linford Christie. And James is doing work on that there. So that's what I'll say on that. On Maisie as a character in Minty Alley, certainly Maisie is one of the most unforgettable characters of pre-World War II Caribbean literature, particularly female characters. However, I actually have become, in reading over Minty Alley more recently, very much drawn to the figure of Philomene, okay, who I think is actually very beautifully drawn, especially since Philomene is an Indo-Caribbean poor woman within the novel, and the level of her exploitation and her otherness as an Indo-Caribbean poor woman in the Afro-Creole dominated society, even in the yard in which you're talking about generally poor working class black people, but the way that Philomene is treated and is seen is an incredible indictment on the way that colonial Trinidadian society is working, and also incredible indictment on the kind of crass majoritarianism that you're going to see in West Indian society, or to put it in the post-independence era, or to put it bluntly, Afro-Creole domination. Okay, political domination that you're going to see afterwards. Originally, I was more drawn to Maisie by the breathtaking comments she makes and how she speaks, but I'm actually more drawn to Philomene than I am to Maisie at the moment. Yeah. But then, even when I speak about that to some of my colleagues, they tell me you really need to read Jane's Career, okay, by Delisier, I believe it is. Somebody can help me out there, which I have not read yet. Even if you want to think about that question of representing women as free agents in certain ways in terms of their sexuality, or you could even go to John Rees, you know, and some of her early novels. So there's also that. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks very much indeed. I just want to ask Arin what I hope will be a short and simple question, which is to reflect more on Joseph O'Neill himself, because I think his Irishness is important, and he also came from a very powerful anti-colonial background in his own life. So, you know, both his grandfathers were jailed by the British, by, you know, his Ottoman Turkish grandfather was, and his Irish grandfather was. So it seems to me that there's a kind of whole back history which needs to be filled in if you can really get the kind of texture of the novel. I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I would be the first to admit that my reading in this paper is just scratching the surface of the kind of dense layers of colonial background in the novel. I mean, thinking about O'Neill as Irish, his protagonist is Dutch, and then the kind of wide-ranging group of immigrants that he interacts with, the protagonist, throughout the course of the novel. I'm not sure how to approach O'Neill's Irishness within the novel. I think, for me, what comes out most strongly is simply that he wanted his protagonist to not be American, and to relate a kind of Eurocentric immigration experience to the kind of Asian or Pan-African immigrant experience, draw contrasts and continuities. So I'm sorry if that doesn't really answer your question.
Two questions really for Paul, which are largely about the context here. One is whether there were any links with Quebec nationalism in terms of the debates you're talking about, because this is sort of build up to the Quiet Revolution. And the other question, partly linked to that, is that the period we're talking about is a period of quite considerable migration between Haiti and Montreal, because the early 60s is when the reality of the Duvalier regime becomes clear, and there's a mass exodus of intellectuals. And I'm wondering whether there is any permeability between Anglophone Caribbean intellectuals in Montreal at the time and the growing community of Francophone Caribbean intellectuals.
Okay, the first part, as I think we've talked about a little bit, I think the relationship between the Québécois nationalist movement and the kind of black radicalism you see here is a bit of a one-way street. I haven't found, there's in the Sean Mills book, which we've talked about, and just in the very title, Nègre Blanc d'Amérique, of the sort of seminal text, or a seminal text of Québécois nationalism, there's a huge amount of borrowing on the part of Québécois nationalists on the black radical tradition. there seems to be less, I certainly haven't found much, in terms of West Indians or other black activists in Montreal who are saying an awful lot about Quebecois nationalism, although it's really interesting when Stokely Carmichael is in Montreal, where James hears him speak. He actually speaks at 3 universities in one day, and when he gets to the University of Montreal, there's this expression that was prevalent at Quebec at the time, very nasty expression that would be addressed to French speakers on the part of English speakers, telling them to speak white. Right? So if a French speaker went up to you and started speaking French, the white person would say, would be reputed to say, "Speak white." When Stokely Carmichael gets to the University of Montreal, he opens his address by saying, "Like you, I don't speak white." Right? So he does make a self-conscious move to try and link what he's saying to what he knows is going on there. But it's kind of, I think, an exceptional moment. I haven't come across a lot that sort of talks about the engagement really going both ways. As for the role of Haitians, there's the Congress of Black Writers was co-organized by people from the Anglophone West Indies and Haitians, and James's evocation of the Haitian Revolution, I think, sort of speaks to that sort of an awareness of that going on. And there were other moments at the West Indian, the Congress of Black Writers, where people were sort of trying to link some of the ideas coming out of that Congress to what was going on in Haiti. And the Uhuru, which is the black community newspaper that comes out in Montreal, published mostly by Anglophone West Indians, had, on a regular basis, articles translated into French, which I can only assume were there, as an attempt to reach out to a broader French black community, which at the time would have meant mostly Haitian. But I think those links aren't as strong as certainly I might have imagined them to be before I went into this research.
I really liked your talk about the Caribbean beyond and your meditations on the term beyond. And I hadn't realized that the Simon Schwarzbach's text, it seems that in translation it was added, the beyond. But I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about Sylvia Wynter and James and going beyond, Sylvia Wynter going beyond James, maybe rewriting James.
Well, Wynter publishes or writes 3 articles on James that I've seen. The first one was In Quest for Matthew Bondman, some cultural notes on the Jamesian poesis, which is in the C.L.R. James's Life and Work. The second one is a paper that she did for the big Wellesley conference on James that I believe Selwyn Cudjoe, I think he's probably in the other room, organized in 1991, in which she did a text that is is very difficult to get hold of, called After the New Class, James, Les Damnés, and the Autonomy of the Public of the Cognition. It's a typical Sylvia Wynter article at that time. It was 90 pages long, okay? I don't think she presented all of that at the conference, however. And then the third one was Beyond the Categories of Master Conception, which is in Paget Henry, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. So those are the main strands of interpretation, these are the main things that Wynter did with James. I think that Wynter's major concern and interest with James, if I was to just summarize it into about 2 or 3 major points, was one, her interest in notes on dialectics and the ways in which a category of condemnation gets produced in the Stalinist gulags, and how James makes us logically for her, or law-likely see that the end result of bureaucratization in the Soviet Union becomes a Stalinist gulags. It's not just about Stalin's personality quirks, well, if you can call it personality quirks. So that's one thing which she finds very important to think about, because as you would know if you're following Wynter's work, she's very concerned with the way that regimes of truth and the way that societies create narratives and understandings of what constitutes a good man or a good woman of its kind, and how this has been taking place and how it's been reproducing itself since the 1600s. So that's one strand that Wynter is very interested in. She's very interested in bondmen and the figure of Matthew Bondman because for her, Matthew Bondman is the price of Western bourgeois man. So in that lovely essay in C.L.R. James, His Life and Work, she talks about how bondman is now referred to as refuse within the post-industrial order. He's referred to by one of Nixon's chief economic aides as depreciated machinery. Okay? However, she says, bondman was not always seen as depreciated machinery. In fact, his labor power was the crucial part of the most extraordinary accumulation of capital that the world has seen in the last 500 years. So this is one of the reasons that she's looking at bondman, and bondman is so important for her. And that passage that I quote towards the very end, she's saying that when bondmans had to refuse the nature of the contemporary Western order, to desire as that by which alone they can live, not a question of redefinition of their labor power. So it's not just a question of a liberation of a productive forces, liberalism and Marxism-Leninism. It has to be a liberation of man. Well, she would say man at that particular time in her writings of 1984. Now she would say the human after man. In other words, the beyond to the experience of human immiseration that bondmans have experienced is going to demand something far more radical than we have imagined. Or to take another piece of Wynter, she once said that people of African descent have undergone or paid, I should say, the highest psycho-existential price for the contemporary Western bourgeois domination of the planet. So what can that actually mean for the bondmans? It can't be just the liberation of labor in that particular way. It has to be a wider liberation of man, or it has to be the human after Western man. You see? We have created a genre of being human for Wynter that is now imperiling the very habitat of the human or the reproduction of our human species. And this is why the break, the beyond, has to be far more daring than even that generally conceived in Marxism-Leninism. And I would say that in some ways she does actually caricature that tradition. I mean, there's a way in which Marxism-Leninism for Wynter becomes very much about the question of economics. She's not going to deal with, for example, the marks of estranged labor, okay? But at the same time, it's an argument that is still compelling, and it's an argument which is still very important.
Well, will you join me in thanking our panelists? Thank you very much.